What I want to talk to you about tonight is putting on your spiritual seatbelt. Okay, when seatbelts were first invented, seatbelts were actually first invented in the 1800s, believe it or not, late 1800s. And they were initially invented for aeroplanes so that, the pilots wouldn't kind of fly out during certain maneuvers. And then they were used in New York taxis for a while, but it wasn't until kind of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that seatbelts became really kind of prevalent in society. And tonight we're going to be talking about the book of Daniel, but the kind of underlying thing is I want to talk about putting on your spiritual seatbelt. And the first thing I want you to think about is, when do you put your seatbelt on? When you're driving a car, when do you put it on? You put your seatbelt on when you get in the car. Most of the time, especially if it's a driving test, you put it on before you even put your keys in the ignition, right? And so we put our seatbelt on before we drive away. Why do we do that? Why do we put our seatbelt on before we drive away? It's because we don't know what might happen as we're driving down the road. And if I was to drive down the road without my seatbelt on, could I put my seatbelt on me just before an accident? Would it be possible? No way, right? The car could come from anywhere. Who knows what might happen? So it would be impossible for me. But here's how people think. They say, yeah, but like I remember when I used to travel to Europe, and other parts of the world. And there's like this mindset in a lot of the world that if you sit in the back seat, you don't have to wear a seatbelt. Like it's safe magically because you sit in the back seat. You don't have to wear a seatbelt. I remember having an accident once with a guy who was the driver of another car. And I hit him. I actually missed the stop sign. The stop sign was like in a tree because it was in a third world country. So stop sign was in a tree. So I missed it and I actually hit the guy. And he was fine in the end, but I hit him in his driver's side door. And he got out of the car all holding his shoulder. He was like in pain. And I said, what happened? And he goes, oh, I hit the steering wheel, when I, when you bumped me. And I said, weren't you wearing your seatbelt? And he goes, no, it's too hot outside. So he wasn't wearing his seatbelt because it was like 30 degrees outside and it was too hot. And I thought, well, that was a bit silly. But my point is, accidents can come from anywhere. That's why we put our seatbelt on ahead of time. And spiritually, it's the same way. Spiritually, we need to put on our seatbelts before the bad thing happens. And for most people, they want to put their seatbelt on right before or even during the accident. And so tonight we're going to talk about the book of Daniel, and I'm going to show you this concept of putting on a spiritual seatbelt. And now there's times when things are going to happen, but as long as we have our seatbelt on ahead of time, we can prevent most of the things happening and we can keep ourselves as safe as possible. A couple of things about the concept or the history of the book of Daniel that I think is really interesting. So Daniel, obviously it's a Hebrew name, but Daniel means God is my judge, or God will judge me. And Daniel was very much a guy that was set apart. And if you look at the book, the books of the Bible, Abraham had his mess with Ishmael, right? Noah had his issues. Everyone had, Cain and Abel, like all these things. There is not one shred of negativity about Daniel in the whole Bible. So Daniel was very different to everybody else, which I find really interesting. So there's no dirt, no faults listed about Daniel. But Daniel really understood this concept of putting on a spiritual seatbelt. I'm going to show you that tonight. And something else that is really interesting to me, when you read through it, and I'll show you this later on, but when we go to Sunday school, we have this kind of image of biblical characters. And sometimes it's actually not a good thing because it doesn't really tell us the truth of what happened to this person. And when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, he was between 70 and 80 years old. He wasn't 25, right? We see Daniel as being like this young guy, but no, he was young. Daniel was brought into captivity when he was about 18. He was a young man, and he was taken into captivity during the days of Nebuchadnezzar, which was one of the kings that was in Babylon. And we're going to pick up the story of Daniel over here in chapter 1. And I'm going to show you guys some really interesting things that are basically life lessons for us. And it really comes down to this putting on your spiritual seatbelt so that you can be prepared for anything. So it says here, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So he came to Jerusalem. This was war. In the end, he wins. And then the king instructs some of his people to bring some of the children of Israel from Jerusalem into Babylon. And this is where we pick up the story of Daniel. And these were people, like he wanted the choicest people. So in verse 4, it says, he asked for young men in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So this is the first thing that you notice here. They wanted the best of the best that Israel had to offer. They had to be good looking, they had to be wise. And the whole point of this was to indoctrinate them into the way of the Chaldeans. And it says here in verse 5, and the king appointed for them, for these young men, a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them. So there's food, there's all this good stuff, and 3 years of training, that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These were Jewish names. These are the sons of Judah. It says, to them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So you guys will know this as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Rakshak and Benny for you that watch VeggieTales. So it's interesting, right? It's interesting to me that one of the first things that they did, was bring all these kids in, gave them food, the best food, gave them training so that they could learn the language and the literature and the customs of the Chaldeans. And then what did? They changed their names. Why did they change their names? You see, names have a very important kind of part in scripture, and names are all about fulfillment of a desire. Like if a parent had a child and wanted the child to mean something or to do something, they would name them that way. And so one of the first things they did is they tried to change the identity of these Israelites. And this is the first instance that we see of Daniel putting on his spiritual seatbelt. So have a look at this. This is in verse 8. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. In other words, Daniel said, I'm going to put on my spiritual seatbelt. I can see what you're trying to do. You're trying to change my identity. You're change my name. You're trying to change who I am as an Israelite. So Daniel was a man that was seeking after God. And so when he saw what was happening, what did he do? He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested to the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. He put on his spiritual seatbelt. He could see that if he goes down this track, he wasn't going to like what was going to happen. And so this is lesson number one for us. We have to purpose in our heart what we're going to do in anything in life. You know, if you get a bad medical diagnosis, that's the wrong time to put on your spiritual seatbelt. Many people are trying to believe God in the midst of a cancer diagnosis. That's really hard. Now, praise God for healing, praise God for the supernatural, and miracles happen, but it is much better for us to know the word and to know who God is long before we need it. Putting your seatbelt on during an accident doesn't work, and trying to believe for something at the peak time of your need is really tough. And so I just want to encourage you, it's so good of you to be on these calls and to be spending time on meditating on God's word, because what you're doing is you're putting on a spiritual seatbelt. You're preparing yourself. And so our goal more and more and more is to try and help you as you learn and grow in your relationship with the Lord, so that you have this permanent spiritual seatbelt on, so that no matter what happens at any point in time, you're protected. Now it says here in verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. In other words, he's afraid. He's saying, if you guys just eat vegetables and water, you're going to look all gaunt and skinny, and then the king's not going to be happy, and he's going to kill me as a result. And so Daniel says to him, verse 11, it says, look, I get what you're saying. I understand that you're afraid. He says, please test your servants in verse 12 for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Naomi would be in love with that. She'd love the vegetables and water. I couldn't think of anything worse. But it says, then let our appearances be examined before you. And the appearance of the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. In other words, he's saying, just test us, compare us after 10 days to the other guys. And if we look the same or better, then you'll be fine. What are you worried about? Just give us a trial run. And in verse 14 says, so he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And as for these 4 young men, remember it's Daniel and his friends, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had a special gift of understanding all visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days, this is that 3-year training period, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Okay, so this is just that snapshot. But again, Daniel chose to be set apart and to be different in his approach. And so this was the first kind of a part of it. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king, he has a dream. The verse 1 in chapter 2 says, now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. In other words, watch yourselves. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. And then he basically goes and challenges them again. And then in verse 10, they respond. It says, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. Because see, initially they were like, yeah, tell us what it is and we'll give you the interpretation. In other words, we can tell you whatever, because how would you know? And then the king basically says, if you do it, I'm going to kill you. And then he's like, it's not possible for anyone to tell you this stuff, right? It's incredible. It says it is, and then in verse 11 it says, it is a difficult thing that the king requests. And watch this, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods. So he's saying the thing that you want to know, only the gods could tell you. And watch this is so crucial, and you'll miss this if you just read it. But it says, whose dwelling is not with flesh. In other words, his magicians, his astrologers, his people of wisdom, they're saying to him that gods, right? Obviously, I'm talking about God, like our God. They're talking about just any gods. Gods do not dwell with flesh. In other words, gods are out there. But you know what's interesting about that? They had a temple and they had a God in the temple. And the whole purpose of having the God in the temple was that the God dwelt with them, right? They had different things. All these different people had gods that they were worshiping. And yet when it came down to it, like to their own fear that they were going to be killed if they got this wrong. And they were like, well, we can't do that. And by the way, there's actually no gods here and they couldn't help you because they don't dwell with flesh. So that's a really interesting perception or perspective from them, that when push came to shove, even they didn't believe in their gods and they were not willing to put their necks on the line on the interpretation from their gods. Okay. So it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing statement. And yet later on, we're going to see them change their mind about that. It says in verse 14, it says that, he was angry. And then says in verse 14, then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon, because Nebuchadnezzar was upset. And he said, just kill all these wise men. And he said, he answers to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. King's upset. He's ordered that all of the wise men be killed. And watch this. It says, so Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Interesting. Go back to verse 14. Then with counsel and wisdom. So you see, he didn't just speak out. He says, then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch. So he went and consulted and used wisdom, and then says, give me some time. It says verse 17, says, then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to his friends. Watch this, verse 18, that they might seek mercies from God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So when Daniel said to this guy, to the captain of the king's guard, let me go and tell the interpretation of the king, he did not have the interpretation at that time. He didn't know what was going on. He had no idea, but he was trusting in God that God would reveal it to him. And he went to his friends and said, hey, by the way, I've promised the king that I'm going to give his interpretation because if I don't, we're dead anyway, right? It says then in verse 19, says, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the Lord, blessed the God of heaven. And then, Daniel says a bunch of things about God. And then he gets brought before the king. Okay. Verse 26, it says, the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? It says, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets, he is capitalized. He's talking about God, who reveals secrets, has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart. So what Daniel's saying here is, I'm going to give you the interpretation, right? And you're going to know what this means. But understand that it is God who's the one that revealed this to you, not me. So Daniel's not taking credit for it. He's saying, I am the giver of the information, but God is the one that's revealed it. And it's been done for you, so that God will clear this up for you. So Daniel has such integrity, because Daniel could have said, well, none of these other magicians could do it, but I could. And he's saying, it's not even me. And he even says, it's not because I have more wisdom than anyone living. It's God that did it. And so it's amazing. You've got here this interpretation that's given. But if you look in the previous chapter, the wise men are saying it's not possible to give this interpretation. And yet Daniel does it. And I'm going to show you, I think it's in chapter 3 or 4, how they changed their tune on this. But let's move on from there and let's talk about the kind of what happens at the end of this. I won't go through because it's not relevant to the concept of the spiritual seatbelt, because I want to kind of touch on some really important pieces. But at the end of all of this, Daniel gives him the interpretation, and then here is the king. The king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. Since you could reveal this secret, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Wow. Verse 48, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him a great many gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So remember, Daniel was a godly man. And now he's the boss of all the pagans and the witchcraft guys and the soothsayers, right? He's now the boss of all the guys that do the complete opposite of what God's told him to do. He gets promoted to being their boss. That's amazing. It says in verse 49, says, also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So you see, because of Daniel's faithfulness, he gets promoted, and now he's in charge of all that stuff. And it's interesting to me because obviously we don't get the time in these scriptures, like how much time went between chapter 2 and chapter 3. But you can see that after this, Nebuchadnezzar has made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. So he just said, your God is the only God. Your God is the God of gods, the King of kings. And then in the very next verse, Nebuchadnezzar's like, I'm going to make an image of gold. And then in verse 2 says, and King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the people, and it says, and all the officials, and to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So they all came, and they stood before the image that he had set up. And then in verse 4, it says, then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, I don't know what that is, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So where did God go, right? First, it was a problem. Then he gets the interpretation. God is God. Then he creates this image. And now if you don't bow down and worship the gold image, now you get killed. And so this is where we discover the story. We all know it. But this is where we discover, the spiritual seatbelt number 2. It says here in verse 8, it says, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke to the king. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn and so on, and does not fall down to worship, shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Verse 12, there are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. And watch this. Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, saying, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I've set up? See, you do not serve my gods. Well, what happened? I thought you were serving the God, right? And now he's upset that they're not serving his gods. It says, now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of those instruments and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God, small g, who will deliver you from my hands? Now, this is the car crash that they didn't see coming, right? They're looking at this and they've been called before the king. And now the king's given them an option. And he's saying, if you fall down and you worship, good. But if you don't, fiery furnace right there. And look at their response. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. I mean, understand something. These boys were captured as servants from Jerusalem. They're serving in Babylon. They've been given positions of authority. They have so much to lose. They're not just, when we see it in, in Sunday school or in different like Bible stories, there's just like these young 16-year-old kids just hanging out in a field and they see the image of the golden image and they don't bow. No. These guys had positions of authority. They were set over parts of the kingdom. They had a lot to lose other than their lives. And basically they just go, well, I don't have to tell you anything. I don't even have to answer you. It says in verse 17, it says, if that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. You see, they've already made up their mind. But if not, verse 18, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you've set up. You see, these boys had set up or had put on their spiritual seatbelt long before this situation happened. They did not decide on the spur of the moment when they were threatened to be thrown into the fire that, oh my goodness, now we have to believe God. God, come and help us. Their mind was already made up long before, because their response is, our God is going to deliver us from this burning fiery furnace, and he'll deliver us from your hand. But even if God doesn't, even if for some reason God doesn't, we will still not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you've set up. And so these boys, these men, They made a decision in their heart. It says at the start, when we first read, it says that Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself. Because when you're in the midst of the fun and you're in the midst of the party and everyone's getting drunk and everything else, it's so much harder to say no. You have to purpose in your heart before those temptations come. And for us, in lots of things in life, we have to purpose in our heart before we're put in that situation. For people that struggle with, alcohol addiction, or they struggle with drugs, or there's some sort of a lust issue, right? You have to purpose in your heart. I am not going to do that thing. You can't go and have 3 drinks and then purpose in your heart you're not going to drink. You can't get around friends that all do drugs and then purpose in your heart after they're all sitting there, after taking whatever they take, and you're like, no, I'm not going to do it. No, you purpose in your heart that you're not even going to be around those people. You see, we put on our seatbelt before we need it, not in the midst of it. And these boys, that's what they did. They put on their seatbelt long before. And you'll see, I'll point it out to you, but you'll see different examples of where they do this and where Daniel does this. In verse 19, it says, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain men, mighty men of valor, who were in his army, to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these 3 men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So think about this. The guys who threw them into the fire, you would think if anyone was going to die, it would be these 3 boys, because the ones that bound them and took them to the fire, they were burnt up. So they were right next to them, right? Because they were bound. So you see, this fire was so hot that even as they were approaching it, they were already protected. Right? Because these other guys died. It says in verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. In other words, yes. But back then, he didn't just say yes, he said true, O king, because he didn't want to die. In verse 25, it says, look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men. Watch this, I've colored it differently. On whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected. And the smell of fire was not on them. So the same fire that burnt up and killed the king's guards had no power on their bodies. Their hair on their head was not singed. Their garments were not burnt. And the smell of fire was not on them. Now, here's something interesting for you to think about. When we get into situations, what do we typically ask God? We ask God to change the situation. We say, God, can you not see the fire? Right? God, can you not see how hot this fire is? I need you to put out the fire, Lord. Bring your heavenly, water cannon and douse the fire. But you see, these guys had already put on their spiritual seatbelt. To them, it didn't matter. They'd already decided ahead of time what they were going to do. And they believed that God was going to save them. But even if not, they weren't going to worship. They'd already made up their decision. And look what happened. God, I believe it was Jesus, meets them in the midst of the fire. And so their prayer was about God, not about the fire. To put out the fire is to honor the fire. To put out the fire is to say this fire is greater than God, and therefore I have to change the circumstance. But you see, what Jesus did is he came in the midst of the fire, and the fire had no power over them. Their hair wasn't singed. Their garments weren't affected. They didn't even smell like smoke. That's how amazing it is when God is with you in the midst of your circumstance. And that's what putting on the spiritual seatbelt is all about. You take Jesus with you everywhere. You carry him on the inside of you. And then no matter what you're going through, he comes and steps into the fire with you. And most of us want God to put out the fire. And God's saying, the fire is not the point. Have me with you. And then it won't matter whether there's fire. We see a similar example, in the New Testament when the disciples are with Jesus and Jesus is in the boat sleeping. And then the disciples come to Jesus and they say one of the dumbest thing ever. Master, don't you care that we perish? They'd already decided we're going to die. And they're sitting there. They wake him up and they sit there and accuse him of being uncaring. Their eyes were towards the storm. Their eyes should have been towards Jesus. You see, when they got on that boat, what they were focused on was the wind and the waves, not who was inside the boat. And Jesus comes out, he calms the wind and the waves, and then he says to them, why are you guys of such little faith? And see what Jesus is saying to them, if I'm in the midst of the fire with you, if I'm in the boat with you, you're going to be perfectly fine. But when you take your eyes off God and you put your eyes on the circumstance, you forget that the person that's in the fire with you is greater than the fire. And see, these boys, they made a decision that it didn't matter about the fire, it mattered of who was going in with them. And they were not affected. It's amazing. God is an amazing God. But most of the time, we stand there and look at the circumstance, we look at the fire, or we look at the mountain, or whatever kind of visualization you want to use, and we tell God to fix that thing. Instead of saying, God, thank you that you walk with me through the fire. And the fire is not even the issue. As long as you're with me, God, I can face anything. And that's real faith in God. That's real trust in God's character to take us through those tough times. And so these boys were not focused on the fire. They were focused on God. And then verse 28 says, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve or worship any God except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Interesting. You made a decree like 2 chapters ago. That any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So he gave him a promotion. So it's interesting, right? This king keeps seeing things, and then he keeps recanting on it. Chapter 4. And so then Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he asks for interpretation again. And, they're looking for how to interpret it. And he calls these magicians again. It's interesting to me. Why does he go to the magicians again? You see, it says over here in verse 6, it says, therefore I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. Interesting. So he wanted this interpretation. He goes back to the people he shouldn't have gone to. But notice that just in the last chapter again, it's like, don't serve any other gods. God is the true God. And by the way, he had a dream previously, if you recall, a few chapters back, and the only one that could answer it was Daniel. And so then after he gets these guys that couldn't help him, then Daniel comes in. And he says, but at the last, Daniel came before me. His name is Belshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you. But remember what they were saying before is that God does not dwell with men. They said that it's not possible because God doesn't dwell on earth with men. God or gods are outside. That's why we can't see them. We can't tap into them. And here Nebuchadnezzar is saying, I know that the Spirit of God dwells with you. He says, and no secret troubles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. And I won't take the time to read it, but basically Nebuchadnezzar becomes crazy effectively, and he loses his mind for 7 years. And eventually he doesn't regain it until he comes to the end of himself and effectively says, God, you are the true God. And then God restores Nebuchadnezzar as king. So I won't go reading through all that. But again, I just find it interesting to me that this king just keeps going back and back and back. And you can see here at the end, all these chapters ended. It says, at the same time, my reason returned to me, And for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles restored to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, and all whose works are truth, and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride, he's able to put down. So he's acknowledging God again. And so it's interesting to me how this king just keeps going back over and over and over the same things. And notice that in none of this does Daniel change. And then we know that later on, there's a feast. And the thing to understand is that there's all sorts of different kings that Daniel serves under. And so here, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, is made king. And then he has this feast. And in the feast, during the feast, a man's hand appears and writes a message on a wall. Again, because the purpose of this is to talk about the character of Daniel, I won't spend the time going into all the stuff, but basically they were praising other gods, they were doing the wrong thing, and so this supernatural hand appears and writes on the wall. And in the end, the new king, he's really troubled. And then he calls the wise men. I'll see in verse 8, it says, now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. Watch this. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. There's another statement that they knew that God dwelt in Daniel. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. So they basically says, call Daniel. So Daniel comes and he gives the interpretation of what was on the wall. And he's telling him that basically your kingdom is going to be taken from you and given to Darius. And so, because of what he did. And so you see there's such a history, and we've always read in the Old Testament, you had all these different people that were either the Israelites or the kings or whatever, and they just kept sinning against God and chasing after other gods, and then God takes the kingdom away from them. Same as what happened with Saul. God took the kingdom from Saul and gave it to David. And actually Daniel comes from the line of David. And so it's interesting that this is another one of those, right? But why I wanted to point this out was that they recognized that even after all this stuff, that God lived on the inside of Daniel, which is really interesting to me because he was the chief of all the magicians and the soothsayers and everything else. And so he was so different. And really kind of where the plot of Daniel's life comes to this crescendo is the one that you know very well. We see it in chapter 6. It says here, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. Now, here's a business principle, if you will. Having good management and good leadership is key to not suffering loss. Okay. So what did Darius do? Darius set over the kingdom 120 satraps or chiefs to be over the whole kingdom. So 120 were like the managers. And over these, there were 3 executives, right? 3 governors. And one of these 3 was Daniel. And then it says he did that so that the satraps could give account to them. So in other words, these managers would report into these governors, of which Daniel was one, so the king would suffer no loss. You see, when you don't have accountability for what's going on in your organization or in your church, and honestly, even in your family, you will suffer loss. One of the best things, and I so respect Naomi for this, when our kids, we homeschool our kids now because of certain circumstances, it just made more sense for us. We traveled a lot. But initially our kids, for most of their lives, they went to school. And one of the best things that Naomi would do is on the way home from school, she would talk to them about what happened at school. And they would share with her all the stuff. She was asking for accountability from them. And even now, we talk to our kids and they tell us about what's going on in their lives and what they're thinking about so that we would suffer no loss. Because, we found that a lot of kids, they hide things from their parents, they deal with stuff. And oftentimes, not always, of course, but oftentimes there were little seeds of those things being planted along the way, but because the parents were not aware of it, they couldn't deal with it. They couldn't deal with those situations. And by the time it was obvious what was happening in that kid's life, it was far too late. The roots of that issue had grown down deep. And so we want to pluck the weed, when it's early on. But we can't do that unless we get an accounting from our children of what's going on. And that way we suffer no loss, or they suffer no loss in their life. So that's an important principle to remember, that accountability is so important. Verse 3 says, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps. He was better than those two. It says, why? It says, because an excellent spirit was in him. An excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. He was going to make him the boss on top of the other two. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. So they were looking at, is he corrupt? Couldn't find corruption. And they said, well, maybe he's going to make mistakes. There was no error found or fault found in him. They couldn't catch him on anything. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. You see, they knew where Daniel stood on his relationship with God. And they knew that if they could do anything, it would have to be something that would pit Daniel against his God, because they knew that Daniel would choose his God every time. How would they know that? How would they know that Daniel would not breach God's laws? We'll see this in a minute. So these governors, basically, they come up with this plan, and they go to King Darius and they say, hey, why don't you make a law that says that nobody is able to worship any other God except you, because you're king, right? You should be worshipped. And Darius goes, that's a great idea. And if anyone does do that, we're going to throw him in the den of lions, because kind of the punishment at the time, right? And so Darius gives this decree, and then he signs it. And after he signs it, Daniel finds out about it. Finds out that the decree is that if you worship or pray to any other god, you're going to be thrown in the lions den. And in verse 10, it says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. And look at this, as was his custom since early days. You see, Daniel, when he heard what he knew that was effectively a death sentence, right? He knew that as soon as Darius had signed the decree, he knew that was a death sentence. And so what would most of us do? We would panic. We would freak out. We'd say, God, please check. Firstly, we would not be in the upper room with our windows open. Our windows would be closed. And if we were going to pray, we'd be in our closet with a blanket on top, right? Very quietly asking God. And see, what does he do? He goes to his upper room. He leaves his windows open towards Jerusalem, and he prays and gives thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. In other words, Daniel was doing this since forever. The reason he wasn't shaken is because he had his spiritual seatbelt on for a really long time. Daniel was prepared mentally and spiritually. He was prepared before the king's decree. That's why he acted the way he acted. He didn't wait until the king gave this decree for him to go and now pray for the first time, right? Verse 11 says, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Found him. They didn't find him. It says they assembled. In other words, they came knowing he was going to do it in order to catch him out. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed the decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Then the king answered and said, this thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. In other words, once the king has said something, it can't be changed. And so the king realizes at this point what's happened. He realizes that he was duped. Remember that early on, the king wanted to put Daniel in charge over everything, right? Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governor and the satraps because he had an excellent spirit in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Understand, Daniel wasn't just some other guy. The king liked him. The king liked Daniel, and he liked him so much he was going to put him in charge of the whole kingdom. And these guys, because of their jealousy, because they didn't want Daniel to become their boss, they come up with this plan. And so then when the king realizes what's going on, it says, and the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. In other words, I can see you're trying to help him, but you're not allowed to, because the law, our law, says that once you've established a decree, you can't change it. And the king said, that's true. It says here in verse 16, so the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Isn't that an amazing statement? Darius knew about Daniel's relationship with God. Darius knew. Remember when the boys, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego speak to Nebuchadnezzar, did you see what their mindset was? God will rescue us from your hand, O king, but even if he doesn't, we won't serve your gods. Here is the king, 2 generations later, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. In other words, he's encouraging Daniel. And he's saying, hey, I know the God you serve, and your God's going to deliver you. It says, then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. In other words, anyone that came past would see that the king was the one that put Daniel there, and they couldn't roll away the stone. And again, like I said at the start, Daniel was about 70 or 80 years of age at this stage. Daniel was no spring chicken. He wasn't, people see it as, maybe Daniel thought that he could fight the lions or whatever. No, Daniel was not young, right? Daniel had been at this for a long time. And so then he says, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually. See, even notice he says, whom you serve continually. In other words, Daniel's been wearing this spiritual seatbelt forever. Has your God been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Interesting. Who is this angel to shut the lions' mouths? Is this the same angel or the same man that was in the midst of the fire with the 3 boys? I wonder. You see, Daniel didn't pray to God to take him out of the lion's den. In fact, Daniel already knew he was going into the lion's den. Daniel knew when the decree was signed that he was going to end up in the lion's den. And yet he went and praised God anyway. And what did he do in his prayer? He prayed and gave thanks before his God. How many of us, if we're going in the lion's den, we're going to give thanks to God? I wonder why Daniel was able to pray and thank God knowing he's going to end up in the lion's den. Not many. The reason why he could is because, you see, he knew who his God was. I believe that Daniel wasn't afraid going into the lion's den. And the reason he wasn't afraid is because he'd been wearing his spiritual seatbelt. What happened to him didn't rattle Daniel, and it shouldn't rattle you, because he knew when he goes into the lion's den that he's not going alone. Because you see, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went into the fire, who turned up? God turned up for them. And so Daniel, this was early on. Daniel saw that. Daniel had a relationship with God, because everyone tells him the God who you continually serve. Everyone tells Daniel that God lives inside him. The Spirit of God is inside. It's incredible to me, right? We go, he must have been fearful. I don't believe he was. He gave thanks to God. And then in verse 21 says, then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I've done no wrong before you. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. So these weren't, people are like, these must have been sleeping lions. These lions were very much awake. And then Darius gives a decree, like every other king, says, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom must men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so we see that what Daniel is doing, what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are doing, is putting on their spiritual seatbelt long before they ever needed it. They came prepared. They prepared themselves when they didn't need God to interfere on their behalf or to intervene on their behalf. And that's what we need to do, brothers and sisters. We have to have our spiritual seatbelt on before. We need to purpose in our heart. We can't do that when we're in the midst of the fire. We can't do that when we're in the lion's den. We can't do that when we're faced with the king telling us that we're going to be killed. We need to do it now. And that's what, doing these studies is all about. That's what you spending time reading the word is all about. That's what you praying in the Holy Spirit, praying in tongues. That's what you're doing. You're putting on your spiritual seatbelt and you're preparing yourself, because you know what? You're not going to get notice when a decree is made that lands you in the lion's den. You're not going to get notice when the king calls you to say, hey, you need to bow down, right? You're not going to get notice. It's going to hit you. You're going to get a bad medical report. You're going to get a bad financial report. You're going to have an issue in your family. You're going to have an issue with your job. And when that happens, are you prepared? And the preparation can't be done at that point. If a country is going to war with another country, one of the most important things is that its soldiers are trained. And one of the worst things that a country could do is get a bunch of civilians and just send them into the war zone, right? They're not effective. They need to be trained. But when is the best time to train soldiers? In peacetime or in wartime? You don't train your soldiers in wartime, even though that's when you really need them. The reason why you have armed forces and you train them during peacetime is so that they're ready to go during times of war. Now, imagine if a country doesn't go to war for 100 years. You could sit there and say, well, what was the point of having an army? You never really needed them. Yeah, but what if? What if? And it's the same with us. People say, well, I will worry about God when I hear a lot of young people say, you know what? I'm young. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to do whatever. And, when I'm older, when I'm, in my 60s, 70s, 80s, that's when I'll pursue God then. How do you know you're going to make it to 60, 70, 80? You don't get a choice. You don't know. You don't know tomorrow. Naomi says that tomorrow is not promised. And it's true. Tomorrow is not promised. And so we always need to be ready. We always need to have our spiritual seatbelts. And the book of Daniel is just a prime example of how these boys came from a culture that was important to them. They came from the Jewish culture. They were brought into a culture that was anti them. Their names were changed. Their identities were tried to be stripped from them. They tried to bring them into this culture. They tried to train them in the king's ways, and yet they maintained their relationship with God throughout it, irrespective of all the stuff going on. And they were willing to give up their lives. They were willing to give up their positions. And the only reason they were able to face what they were facing was because they put on their spiritual seatbelt ahead of time, and they maintained that relationship with God. Daniel served his God continually. That was his custom to pray. And so the way that we build ourselves up will really determine how we are when we get thrown into the fire or into the lion's den. So I just want to encourage you in closing, keep your spiritual seatbelt on. Don't wait until you need it. Put it on long before and just keep wearing it every day, and it'll keep you safe.